Before we begin this podcast, I want to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons over on patreon.com/bitterbrownfems. You can find the link in the description. But special shout out to all of our BBF BFFs who are Cristian Galindo, Evelyn Preciado, and Cassandra Tapia. Y'all are real ones. Much love to y'all. If you want to support this podcast and get things like bonus episodes or video episodes, go ahead and click the link in the description. That's patreon.com/bitterbrownfems. And yeah, let's start the show. Hello, hello, hello. It is your girl Ruben coming to you from Portland, Oregon today. And this week's recession indicator is Gavin Newsom's flip-flopping on like fucking everything. Like, if you don't know, Gavin Newsom is like the governor of California, and he's like seen as this like liberal superhero, right? Like, in so many ways, being poised to be like the Democratic nominee in 2028, if that election even happens. Um, but he's already being like, lined up, paraded around as like our best hope for 2028. He's making his rounds in all the podcasts and news networks. He's always being tapped to give his opinion on shit. And he even has his own podcast where he frequently hosts like right-wing folks like Ben Shapiro, who's like a far-right fucking grifter. Um, and recently Gavin Newsom has been taking a task on social media, particularly twitter.com, when people are like, yeah, I'm not voting for this guy. Like, he's, at the time was, very pro-Israel. And when he had Ben Shapiro on his podcast, just let him, spew out like all this pro-Israel bullshit. Um, and Hassan Piker, who's like this noted, like, um, leftist like streamer was like, I'm not voting for him. And everybody and their mom, all the liberals and their mama were like dragging Hassan for like, you don't care about like marginalized people because you don't want to vote for fucking Gavin Newsom. Meanwhile, Gavin Newsom's out here like fucking using the dismantling of like homeless encampments as a photo op. Like that motherfucker hates homeless people. He does everything in his power to like fucking keep them from the public eye. And in his fucking time as governor has not done anything to make their lives better. Like, but that's just like on just as one of the many issues to him. There's also the issue of like, you know, letting incarcerated firefighters basically work for $1 on the fucking hour, and not being able to be hired for that work afterwards, which, he recently, I think it's like recently as like 2 years ago, he got to have a say in whether or not that would pass. Um, and shit like that. Uh, but and people also want to say that like he's like this pro LGBT like candidate or whatever, or like politician. Meanwhile, he's going on podcasts saying that like um the way to win the next presidency is to care less about pronouns and divisive issues like that. And I'm like, first of all, it's like a dog whistle, right? To go on a podcast and say like we need to care less about pronouns is like a dog whistle, and dog whistle being like things you say like that have subliminal meanings that only people who are like looking for them will find them, right? So if you're like a leftist or maybe even a liberal, you don't think of like trans people as just pronouns, right? Like you think about, the totality of a trans person. And maybe when you talk about trans issues, you say like, you're specific. You say trans issues or, issues that affect trans women or trans people or trans men, blah, 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 right? You don't say like pronoun issues or shit like that, right? But you know who does use pronouns as a shorthand for trans people is Republicans, conservatives, far right motherfuckers. And that's because somewhere along the way, they started to believe that only trans people have pronouns, right? Never mind the fact that everybody has pronouns because that's just how the English language works. We're all languages. I mean, I'm pretty sure there's languages that don't have pronouns, but I can't think of them at the top of my head. Um, but yeah, most languages have pronouns. That's just the way we communicate, and they're not exclusive to trans people. But because the right wing, like, they just, they ain't educated. They went to bumfuck, nowhere school that teaches them that Trump is God or whatever. They liken the basic fundamental English usage of pronouns to trans people. When they hear like pronoun issues, they think trans people, right? So Gavin Newsom is like trying to talk the language of the right wing in order to court that voting body. And throwing LGBT folks under the bus in that process, right? Um, Particularly trans people. And I've seen, these some of these famous instigates being like, no, that's not what he meant, blah blah. Like he just meant we can't be focusing too much on like, these niche issues. And it's like, no, these quote unquote niche issues matter because like the things that affect the most marginalized will eventually affect us, right? We already have states like Kansas revoking the licenses of trans people um, because it doesn't accept their gender marker on their IDs, and it's forcing them to get to a DMV and like quote unquote correct it, right? You think that's not gonna come for folks eventually who represent other marginalized identities or that maybe are dissidents of the state, like it will. They will find an excuse to implement the same punishments they are implementing on the most marginalized, using those legal the way this legal system works is that they use like precedents to justify like new rulings, right? Um, so with like the trans like ID thing in Kansas, they're gonna use that precedent to then be like, well, we've already revoked, IDs, based on like, medical paperwork or whatever. That's gonna trickle down to, whatever other medical identity they choose to not let drive, right? Pick a disability, right? From that disability, they're gonna build a case to, people of colors, or have a similar this they just use presidents to build upon like to then enact more like cruelty, right? And the same is used in the opposite direction, right? Like, you know, gay marriage passed because there was precedents for, people, of, same sex or some circumstance being married, right? Or they'll use certain amendments to justify, right? Like, things like marriage or whatever. Like everything that happens is eventually used as an excuse to justify something else in the legal system. So, like these are not like niche pronoun issues. These are all issues that will eventually affect us. If you remove the rights of someone, no matter how marginalized, they will eventually come to take your rights as well. They will use that as an excuse to justify your oppression. So like, no, niche issues are everyone's issues, plain and simple. But Gavin Newsom flip-flopping on like being quote unquote pro LGBT to all of a sudden trans people don't matter. And I want to remind you that who else did this in 2024 when she was running her race? Kamala Harris, yes, ma'am. She was saying, people were like, oh, she's gonna protect, LGBT folks. Meanwhile, she's saying she was gonna leave LGBT or specifically trans rights to the states. That another dog whistle, right? That was basically going to allow states to discriminate against trans people. Um, but Gavin Newsom, stand for nothing Newsom. Um, in most recent weeks, and this is being shot in the second week of March, in most recent weeks, has gone on record saying that Israel is, now that, we can't justify Israel's bombing or reckless bombing of Iran. Like Newsom finally called Israel an apartheid state, right? Uh, Basically saying that like the leadership of Israel is leading us down a wrong path, and this was while he was on Pod Save America, which ill, while he was promoting his memoir, his newest memoir. And like that's such a like flip-floppy thing to do, but it's because he saw like a recent polling that basically placed Palestine as like a key issue that's on the minds of Americans and that essentially lost Kamala the the election, but because he saw all those polls and shit, now he's flip-flopping on this shit. But still like maintaining like a liberal Zionist spin on it where he still blames Netanyahu on this shit, right? Blaming the leadership of Israel as opposed to the existence of the Israeli state. Um and that just shows like this motherfucker is broke. He is looking for a fucking way into the White House. And if that means looking like he has no backbone, like looking like he has no actual platform or like, and what I meant by backbone was like a moral backbone. Um, he doesn't care. He needs that fucking presidential money. And that's the same reason he's fucking promoting his little memoir up and down this podcast circuit. Um, which the memoir is like a jumping point to being like to being seen as like a serious, contender, right? Uh, need I remind you that even JD Vance, went the memoir before jumping big state politics type shit. Like that is just the way, that's one of the angles that folks take into the presidency and to gain notoriety. Um, so yes, that is my recession indicator for this week. Um, Other things happening in politics are that Jasmine Crockett lost her race against Tellerico. Um, Jasmine Crockett was seen by like the liberal core as like a strong contender for the Senate in Texas, but she like literally had no platform. Like she built a brand of personality which might have worked in like a 2016, you know, Obama era Lizzo radio time, but that's just not where we are right now. Like people are kind of seeing past, you know, performative identity politics type shit and now care about issues, particularly class issues that politicians such as James Tallarico, who is the person who beat her for the Democratic nomination, are centered on, right? I think that, it is, how do I say this? It is not a bad thing to understand like the systems of oppression as they pertain to our identities, right? But they can be easily corrupted, right? I think I've mentioned before, I think it's like the rich people love identity politics because they can blame things like racism and homophobia and transphobia for the issues of the world without having to look inward, right? Without having to look at the way capitalism fucks people up. Um, and it's easy to capitalize on those things, right? If we just celebrate Pride and Latinx Heritage Month, then all these issues of capitalism can be overlooked or, will be destroyed when that's not the central issue. We can celebrate Latinx Heritage Month all fucking year, but if Latinx people are still being deported and, racially targeted, and, make less money than their white counterparts, then it's then that doesn't fucking matter. right? So when, Jasmine Crockett and her supporters were using things like, vote for black women. Well, what are this black women's issues? And she didn't have like a full, like, on her website, even have like a full issues page because she was banking on getting voted in by name recognition. It was so bad, in fact, that her issues page at one point had just like her, her web designer or whatever, like built the issues page and then kind of built the bullet points. And then like under some of them, there was just sentences like, oh, please fill in with one or two sentences to a paragraph about this issue. Like literally leaving instructions on her site. Like that's crazy. And to want to run in Texas, a red state as like as a Democrat, like you need to have your shit on lock. And you know, James Tallarico had his shit on lock. He spoke to a population that is ready for, anti-establishment, kind of populist left-wing voters. Um, and Jasmine Crockett being, out of the race, um, ended up being for the better because she gave up her seat in the House, that meant that other people could run for it. And in her case, Frederick Haynes III won the Democratic nomination for her seat for the Texas 30th Congressional District. Um, Frederick Haynes is a more leftist politician. He is a pastor who's been a longtime activist and like who has, been shown on video like essentially showing like being maybe a little too badass and pro-Palestine, like on October 8th, being too badass and pro-Palestine for someone who wants to run for like a public seat, in leftist circles, all props to him, but for the normie general public, maybe he was doing a little too much because on October 8th, like right after the October 7 attacks happened in 2023, he was like giving a sermon where essentially he was like, what I should be doing here is, sending condolences to Israel, but essentially like fuck that, like, free Palestine, like, they had it coming, blah blah blah, which is like pretty fucking ballsy for somebody who wants to have a seat in the Senate. But props to him. I hope he wins his race. I hope Tallarico wins his race. Shout out to Las Culturistas, fucking Bone Yang and Matt Rogers, who called this shit like a month earlier, right? Who said, don't give your money to James Crockett because she's making this race about herself, as opposed to like the issues, which was a fair judgment, and it is what ended up costing her the race. And they were dragged to hell and back for it, being called all sorts of things outside their name about like, oh, white people, like white gays are still white or whatever, or like Bowen Yang is like aligning himself with like white supremacy because white gay people, blah blah. It's just like no, we're just like seeing past identity politics. We're getting to the root of the issue, which is like class inequality at this point, and also seeing through like the veneer that like some of these politicians, which build cult of personality over actual policy work, like, and choosing to vote against that, which we have seen time and time again, do not render results. So shout out Texas. I hope things go well for Tallarico and Haynes. Um, it's gonna be it's gonna be a hard battle. It's fucking Texas. Like to go blue there is hard as fuck, and especially with all the restrictions that Trump wants to put into place, like the voter ID restrictions, blah blah, which goes back to my original point about trans people. Like you think they're just like changing their markers for fun or just because they're hateful? Like no, it's about voter suppression, right? They are, and that goes hand in hand with the new like voter ID laws and Trump wants to impose, right? So stay awake, stay keep your finger on the pulse of these upcoming midterm elections. Liberals want to say, vote your way out of the fucking oppression or whatever. Well, let's get to it this midterm so that they can't talk out the side of their mouth when the time comes. And we're like, you know what? We voted all the things that needed to be voted for. Now let's get to work. Um, because you know who isn't getting to work? Fucking Cash Patel, who, if you don't know, is a director of the FBI and also like possibly the man with like the most cross-eyed, wide open eyes I have ever seen in my life. Like, girl, I don't know if you guys know Pokemon like that, but there's this Pokemon called Zatu where like one of his eyes sees like the future and one of his eyes sees the past, and so he's always like constantly like traumatized and like blank stare. And I feel like that's what's happening with Kash Patel. Like his eyes are the most open eyes I've ever seen in my life, and they are cross-eyed and like consistently look like this motherfucker is seeing the most traumatic thing in his life. And it is kind of hilarious. And I'm sorry for making fun of his physical appearance, but I just kind of needed to get a jab in there because this motherfucker is not only wasting like taxpayer money flying the fucking government private jet like to enforce to watch his girlfriend perform or whatever, or to attend other like celebrity events like going to the Winter Olympics. Um, but his usage of this private jet is so bad that actually um recent reports have shown that because he was taking this private jet, the jet was unavailable for actual FBI like investigative like purposes. Like the FBI couldn't get people fast enough to like the Brown University shooting, and maybe most importantly to our right-wing friends, couldn't get to like the Charlie Kirk situation fast enough, right? So this is an issue that pertains to you two right-wing listeners. You don't exist. I'm just comedic effect. Um, this motherfucker is wasting all of our resources um to just fly around and be a fucking nerd. Like he was the most recent and like most publicized loser move is that he went to the Winter Olympics to go celebrate with the men's hockey team when they won gold, right? And you see this motherfucker just like chugging beer like he's in a fucking frat for the first time, more like he's being hazed. And you know, just looking a fool. And I'm just like, when I look at him, it's just like, especially in that moment, like smashing a beer with the hockey players who just won gold and wearing their medal. It's just like one of the most pathetic scenes I've ever seen. Like, you know, a little about me. I'm in a rugby team with a bunch of straight guys now. And there's this like dynamic that happens sometimes where like it's very evident that some guys have never been the cool guy and um kind of like overcompensate by like kind of doing whatever the quote unquote cool guy in a group does, right? And one example of that is like chugging beers to like be like, I can keep up, I can drink with the best of you. And it's like nobody like if people are asking you to chug beer or whatever, it's because they want to see you look like a loser. Like they want to see you act a fool. In these type of scenarios. And that's what he looks like. He looks like somebody being hazed, even though he's like technically one of the more powerful mans in fucking US. But he's out here flying to fucking Winter Olympics, to Italy, to Milan, to watch these hockey players who nobody fucking knew about before, which because again, nobody gives a fuck about hockey. Um, and has, you know, takes a call from Trump while chugging beers with these hockey players, where Trump tells the men's, he congratulates the men's hockey players and then says that they're all invited to the White House. And he's like, oh, but we gotta invite the women. And like as if he was forced to do that, right? Like, haha, women gotta come too. And all these motherfuckers in the men's USA hockey team laugh Never mind the fact that the women's hockey team is like the most winningest of the two, winning, taking like way less of the time, something like uh 16 years compared to the men's like 30 or something like that to get as many gold medals. And like, never mind the fact that like throughout the men's history as a hockey team, there's been years where they don't even medal, but the women have never had that problem, right? So never mind the fact that like the women have been the superior team for ages. Like just the fact that they respect disrespecting them, despite like even though like they had like a harder game and like a harder like bracket than the men's team is wild. But the women did not accept the invitation, the reluctant invitation from the president. Instead, they are being celebrated by Flavor Flav, who is, you know, a definition of a girl dad, and he's out here supporting all sorts of, Olympic sports, primarily those of who are that are for women. Um, and they're getting like basically like a whole heroes welcome in Vegas in the summer. So shout out them. Um, and it reminds me of this shit of like all these transphobes, and the Riley Gain types are like protect women in sports. Like, you know, what about women in sports? And it's like, meanwhile, like women in sports are facing discrimination from the fucking president himself, right? Because this is just one example, right? Like valuing men's sports over women's, like this public humiliation of like Trump going, on the phone and that being recorded and published in the media. Like that's just a microcosm of things. The bigger issues of like are like why aren't female athletes being paid equally to the men, even if they have more like a better track record? You know, why are they facing like sexual harassment at higher levels, like ridiculous levels than their male counterparts? Like, things like that matter more, right? Than like, you know, that's what people really should think about like protecting women in sports more than like, whether or not trans people can actually play, which like y'all couldn't even name a professional trans athlete if you tried. Like the people who care about the, quote unquote care, they don't really care is what I'm trying to communicate. They don't really care about women's sports. What they really care about is about discriminating about against other people. They need to punch down on someone and they just chose trans people as their target. They don't really care about women's sports because if they cared about women's sports, they would fucking at the very least attend their games. They would fucking patronize their stuff. And they would make sure that their women's sports are respected, but that's just not the fucking case. Um, yeah, so that has been part of Cash Patel's bullshit journey. Um, Meanwhile, God, we're at war with Iran, and it might like on paper it's not us, it is Israel, but it's like Israel is our proxy, right? They are, and by that I mean like Israel is essentially the representative of United States interest in the Middle East, quote unquote Middle East. Um, what they do is an extension of us, right? We have been so tied together because of their formation being pushed by the US, because of their funding. So much of their funding comes from us. Need I remind you that, US tax dollars pay for Israeli healthcare and bombs, all that fucking shit. So yes, Israel is bombing Iran with US bombs right now. Um, that's where our fucking money's going. And all this, bullshit with like, you know, making us focus on identity politics and all these like other issues that make us fight one another are to distract from the bullshit that the Epstein list class is, you know, doing, which is bombing, raping, and harming people, right? Because need I remind you, like all these people in power, so many of them are the on the Epstein list and are on it like thoroughly, right? And of course, just because you get mentioned there doesn't mean blah blah, but most of these people are hella what's that word? Essentially criminalized on that list, right? Um, and I said that thing about like, oh, just because you're on the list doesn't mean necessarily mean something. Is because it's like people want to like, what's that word? Straw pick, make straw man arguments that like, oh, everybody's on the Epstein list because blah blah. Just because you get mentioned or whatever doesn't mean you're bad. And it's like, yeah, I fucking know the way a search engine works or whatever, which like I know that fucking RuPaul's on the list because somebody downloaded RuPaul's Drag Race All Stars 2 on the fucking flight to the Epstein Island. That's nobody's saying RuPaul's on the fucking Epstein list. Like when people say somebody's on the Epstein list for reals, it means that they're fucking like named, mentioned, like taking part in criminal activity, right? And it's mostly all these motherfucking billionaires who are making these decisions to waste our tax dollars, to essentially steal from, the average human in order to fund their fucking genocidal, harmful bullshit. And in things that have made me less bitter this week, I have going to a Sarah Larson concert. I have loved Sarah Larson for about a year now, and I have been trying to get everybody else to jump on the Sarah Larson train. And thanks to Alyssa Louis, um, she is finally making huge waves in the US. And also thanks to the stateside remix of Pink Panthers, which I knew was gonna be a fucking banger. When it came out, like it was just everything. And I've been trying to convince my friends to get on the Pink Panthers and Sarah Larson train, like independently. And then when they did that collaboration, I was like, y'all bitches need to jump on this now. And they have been resistant to it. So shout out Stefo and Luis, you fucking bitches, for not heeding my warning about the fact that Sarah Larson was gonna blow up, and she did. Um, these are the same people again who would listen to me when I told them that Chappell Roan was gonna blow up. So y'all can suck it. I am once again correct. I am the pop oracle. But I saw Sarah Larson in concert recently in Portland, and she was so good. Like the venue where she played was so small, but she made it feel like a stadium. It was like, and honestly, probably my like least favorite venue in Portland, like the Crystal Bar. Oh, like bottom three. There's a lot of bad venues here in Portland. Yeah, what's that? Crystal Ballroom is definitely down there. Hawthorne Theater is really bad too. Um, the Roseland is bad depending on where you end up standing because there's these two huge pillars covering everything. But Sarah Larson really blew up fucking Crystal Ballroom. She had banger after banger. Her choreography was on point. Her vocals were on point. Her audience interactions were everything. She technically performed Midnight Sun 3 times, one in the beginning and twice towards the end. But, one of them was the regular version, then there was the a cappella version, then there was the remix version, and they were all so good. And it was just like, that's such a banger song. And Midnight Sun really deserved some recognition on the Grammys. I don't know. Maybe Abracadabra did deserve it over Midnight Sun, but the song is just so incredible. And the stateside remix is blowing up again because of the Winter Olympics, the ice skating routine that Alyssa did. And if everything goes according to what the pop predictors are saying, that by the time this episode is published, Sarah Larson might have her first top 10 hit. And seeing the success of somebody who is not only super talented and super fun, but also who stuck by her guns, like she is like a super leftist, like Swedish artist who was calling out the US government, saying fuck IS and free Palestine, when she could have risked losing her work visa. Like that's standing on business. And I support that. And I particularly support, hot bitches who can make badass music and be super leftist. Most recently, she commented on a post where a fan was like, you know, at her concert and took a video of Sarah Larson really killing the vocals on Midnight Sun. And the caption was like, I'm glad that my baby got to see Sarah Larson kill Midnight Sun before I aborted it. And then Sarah Larson replied like, "Oh, I was killing it on the stage, but you killed it after the show." Like that's pretty iconic. And people try to drag her for that, but Sarah Larson did not back down from that opinion. And that's why she's my current GOAT of up and coming pop girlies. And she's really what's making me less bitter. I love pop music. I love politics, and I'm glad that when somebody can, be in the pop space without losing themselves. So shout out to Sarah Larson. Thank you for making me less bitter. But let me know what's making you less bitter. Shout out in the comments, and over on Patreon. And thank you for listening to us. All right, take care of yourselves. Bye. All right. Before I leave this episode, I want to give a huge shout out to all of our I Know Her level patrons over on patreon.com/bitterbrownfans. And who do I know? That's Fernando Peña, Selena Portera, Miranda E, Magdalena Saucedo, Ronnie Leva, and Bianca Garcia. Y'all are real ones. And of course, I know her. All right. Take care of yourselves. Bye.